So now I'll carry on our series that we're doing at the moment on Mind in Harmony. I'll say a little bit about where we are in the series. This is the second last week, so it'll finish next week. I'll say a little bit about where we are, because as well as being a series, each one kind of stands alone too. So, but I just wanted to kind of orientate us a bit. So we're looking at this book, Mind in Harmony by Subhuti. I'm really sorry to say, at the moment, the books are only on order. They're not right now in the LBC Bookshop. So I have the LBC Bookshop manager's permission to mention Amazon, where you can get a copy of this if you would like. And I really recommend it. The subtitle is The Psychology of Buddhist Ethics, which is a bit complicated sounding, but it's basically it's a contemporary translation of a traditional Buddhist analysis of mental events. So everything that happens in the mind. There are lots of lists in the Buddhist tradition that purport to kind of cover everything that happens in the mind between them, if you see what I mean. And this is one of them. But it's by a very, very experienced order member, a senior order member, called Subhuti, who's an excellent kind of, explainer really. Makes something very deep into something quite plain speaking, but inspiring. So I'd recommend this book, Mind in Harmony. And we split it into 6 sections for these evenings. And my section tonight is 98 pages long. So I thought, cheers, guys. And covers, I wasn't sure, either 37 or 39 mental events. But I've picked 4 to speak about this evening, so you might be glad to hear. But I'll just say where we are in the kind of series. We started with a section called Mapping the Mind, which is basically some basics about what the mind is or is like. The human mind, this thing that you can't experience without, if you see what I mean, and it's always affecting us and actually mediating everything that we know and experience. And then something about the art of mind watching, so starting to look at what's happening in your mind and how to distinguish between different mental events. And then that gives you how the mind works. So that was kind of the 5 pieces, the fundamental structure of the mind, according to this analysis. A list called the constants, 5 things that are always happening, and of which everything else is a sort of subset. And last week, Dharma talked about how the mind becomes absorbed. So you can see a kind of trajectory through that. What is the mind? How do you watch the mind? What's actually happening in the mind? But then, for our purposes, that it's getting really more to the point now when you say, how does the mind become absorbed? And tonight, I'm talking about transforming the mind. There's an awful lot in this section. I'll just give you a little flavour of what's described. We've got things like faith, lack of faith, scrupulousness, reverential shame and shamelessness, contentment, goodwill, compassion, clarity, conceit, inflation, views, vagueness, ardour, equanimity, attentiveness, vigilance, carelessness, awareness, and so on. There's a kind of huge range and amazing job that Subhuti's done, kind of making sense of it and creating a sort of journey through it. I've kind of I've boiled this down, I hope, and I'm just going to talk about 4 things. He often sort of pairs things. The traditional list just gives you kind of huge long lists of things called afflictions and subsidiary afflictions and variables and that sort of thing. But Subhuti helpfully kind of pairs things up with things they're related to or their opposites. I'm going to talk about 2 pairs particularly tonight. And that is faith and shame and clarity and ignorance. So if the overall subject is transforming the mind, I'm going to talk particularly tonight about faith and shame and clarity and ignorance. And I'll say why. But another reason that we're really getting to the point now is that whole section that I just read a sample of, that I think has 39 items on the list, is where you definitely get into dividing these mental states between skillful and unskillful. So that's Buddhist language, if you like, for ethical and unethical, or helpful and unhelpful, conducive to growth or hindering of growth. So whereas in a list like the constants, which are things like contact and feeling, some of them are ethically significant, some of them aren't, some of them just arise whether you like it or not. Well, the constants are always there, that's why they're called that. But now when you get into things like hatred and serenity, for example, you can tell that you're in territory that's ethically much clearer. All these mental states are now, in themselves, either skillful or unskillful, as the traditional language has it. And you'll know, if you've been coming along a little while, or if you've done our ethics course, that Buddhism doesn't split things into good and bad. It's always concerned with skillful and unskillful, and that like something that you could be skillful at, like a sport or a craft or something. If you wanted to make a really good pine table, if you're unskillful at cutting a straight edge, well, your table won't be as good, if you see what I mean. So it's just a fairly kind of clear matter of what's helpful and what's not for our goal and our purpose. And just to sort of at least invoke the kind of uber context of all of this, of course, the goal of Buddhist practice is enlightenment. And that's embodied in most Buddhist traditions by a Buddha figure like this one, which is golden, so that, well, Kuslasara mentioned that the mind can become golden in the first half, didn't you? And the Buddha's golden partly for that reason, that we can take the raw material of our ordinary humanity and raise it up to something completely radiant. So everything that we're talking about in these sessions, if you like, is details of how to do that. But obviously we can't do without the details. We can't do without a bit of a map for how to get from kind of where we are now to something that probably feels a bit like this figure looks. Obviously this is just a figure in one sense, but it could also be a symbol. In other words, it could have a life of its own. I don't want to say it's just a figure, but it's got qualities that are intended to spark off in us a response to the values that they suggest. You see what I mean? That was a bit of a roundabout way of saying it, but we have images of enlightenment as well as these kind of conceptual maps, so that we can just relate on a heart level to an ideal that we want. Yeah. So that overall ideal of enlightenment is always in mind, and it's always the goal. Even though in itself it wouldn't be a static point, it would actually just have lots and lots of further unfoldings and expressions if we got there. Okay, so skillful and unskillful is how to steer, well, either towards or away from Buddhahood in the end. And of course, skillful actions, when we're more helpful, generous, loving, giving, they'll have pleasant consequences in themselves as well. We will become happier on the basis of acting in that way, and unhappier if we're cruel or mean-spirited, unkind, and so on. So that's something about skillful and unskillful. Perhaps I'll now go to my kind of little list for the evening. So it's flip chart time. We had a little debate before the class about whether flip charts are really helpful. I don't know, but there's a lot of terms flying around, and Philippa said yes, they are good. So there's our two pairs of mental events tonight. So faith and shame, and clarity and ignorance. I'll probably mainly talk about faith. Clarity here can kind of stand for, the ultimate clarity is enlightenment. So that can stand in its utmost expression for the goal that I've been talking about, and ignorance in its sort of worst expressions is the furthest you can go from that, if you see what I mean. So here's a kind of, and of course there are more ordinary day-to-day expressions of clarity and ignorance as well. I'll come back to that. But I'm mainly going to talk about faith and a little bit about shame. Yes, faith. If only there was a different and better word for it. Quite often we leave this in its Sanskrit form, Shraddha. So you may have heard the word Shraddha. Partly faith has just got, I don't know, lots of connotations. Maybe some of them are pleasant, I don't know. Lots of people will have an unpleasant connotation for, in the area of kind of blind belief in an institutional religion that we've, I don't know, had some experience of and thrown off and not wanted to be reminded of, say. Or just an aspect of religious beliefs that we know that we're not, that we don't buy particularly. Christians have faith in God, don't they, and struggle with faith, sometimes lose it. You either do or don't have faith, and that a lot of the time will seem to be a matter of do you accept something that you cannot necessarily know, if you see what I mean. Anyway, that's not what faith is in Buddhism. So sometimes you see this translated as confidence, and I'll say what that's confidence in. But confidence also is a little ambiguous because somebody could do something unethical quite confidently, if you see what I mean. Somebody could be quite confident in speaking harshly to somebody else. So confidence doesn't quite sound right. And the reason I say that is that this tradition of the Abhidharma, this presentation of the mind, says that faith is present in every positive mental event. So generosity, kindness, contentment, vigour, mindfulness. It's saying that faith is present in all of those every time, if you see what I mean. So it's a much more kind of, it's not an intellectual belief, and a lot of the time it's not even necessarily a conscious experience. It's basically a response to value. Our founder Sangharakshita said, it's the response of what's ultimate in us to what's ultimate in the universe. So I quite like that as a formulation. Something that's ultimate in the universe generates a response of what's ultimate in us. Ultimate might just mean best. So the best in existence sparks a kind of response from the best in us. So it's like whenever you have I think in a lot of sort of forms of admiration, there would probably be some of what Buddhists call faith. I'm just thinking what some examples might be. This is quite a large sort of area. You might just have a response to the three ideals of Buddhism. So the possibility of a human becoming enlightened, or the way to get there, or even the community of practitioners working their way towards it, or who've already attained something of that goal. For a lot of us, that will be, some of that will sound a bit distant and abstract, but actually, if for example, I know not all of you will have had this, but if you've walked into a shrine room and seen an image like this, and felt your heart respond a little bit, and have a kind of draw towards it, or even just a kind of instinctive yes, or even a kind of pleasure, the Buddhist tradition is saying there's faith in that. And it's not really a sort of religious matter, so-called faith, if you see what I mean. It's like I say, it's a response to value. So you're seeing value, something that you'd like to go towards or want in your life, or even just recognise as true, without necessarily articulating that to yourself, if you see what I mean, and feeling drawn towards it or having a response. But yeah, other examples for me, because there's nothing necessarily Buddhist about this state. I hope that's sort of becoming clear. Other examples for me would be, a couple of others have a Buddhist context, say. I've found that the life of our founder, Sangharakshita, inspires faith in me, because he was, in many senses, an ordinary human being, in that he was human. I mean, I think he was an extraordinary human being too, but, I went to meet him a few times. You could meet him, you could talk. I don't know, he asked a bit about my life. I asked him a bit what he'd been thinking about. He talked about the music he'd been listening to and why. So, he was a human being on that level like any other, but had a really extraordinary life in terms of his response to an ideal and his work for it. Such that, for example, in a sort of unremarkable Indian hill town where his teacher said, stay here and work for the good of Buddhism, and got in a jeep and drove off somewhere else, he did that. If you see what I mean, spent 14 years working for the Dharma in this place that he thought he was just going to be visiting. But really gave up the comforts of ordinary life to work, as far as I can see, tirelessly to help others grow. And anyway, when I read those stories, when I bring that to mind, I get an arising of something like faith, what I would call faith, because I'm a human being too, and I'm not quite doing that. I'm not doing it at all. I'm trying to follow in his footsteps in my small way, but I definitely recognise a flavour there of what's higher, and that's what a Buddhist would call Shraddha. Another example would be, your experience of coming to a Buddhist centre. I've talked about a shrine room, but even if you just come to a Buddhist centre and learn the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana, and have an instinctive response of feeling drawn towards it, there's Shraddha or faith in that. My experience of coming to my first meditation class was that it was good. I sort of appreciated it. There were no fireworks. But I just knew I was going to come back the next week. And even that, it wasn't a really exciting feeling. I just knew I was going to be back the next week to do it again, if you see what I mean. And then I kept doing that. And you could say that in that was basically a recognition of something of value that started to actually motivate me. So faith, it often won't be a feeling. It's like voting with your feet. If you've kept coming to a Buddhist centre, if you've come every week for 3 months or whatever, or you've been on a retreat, say, and that's affected you and you've wanted to continue and take your practice deeper, there's faith in that. But you could have more striking examples as well. And like I said, it could be quite outside the kind of ordinary purview of Buddhism. So there was a story in the media some years ago of a very shocking story of a boy who was killed, a schoolboy, who was killed by a gang. I think they were all teenagers, the victim and the killers. I can't remember his name. And the perpetrators were caught, and the parents of the murdered boy forgave those killers in person and publicly in the media. It just forgave them completely in a few kind of very, very moving, obviously felt sentences. And I remember being so struck by that and so moved. Again, because I think it's so much more than I've managed with my life, if you see what I mean. And such a heroic place to be in the mind, if you see what I mean, to actually forgive something that awful, really. So even though that's got a more painful story and context, you could say that there's a similar kind of heart connection to something that you just admire and just know is good. You don't have to sort of discuss it with yourself, if you see what I mean, which is why I'm saying faith isn't an intellectual matter. Okay, so I'll say we'll break down faith a little bit more now, and then kind of perhaps reflect a little bit amongst ourselves, and then I'll carry on through the other three. So to kind of come back to the course that we're steering, and in terms of our wish to grow towards enlightenment, and not just for our own suffering to stop and for our own, release from our problems. You can break faith down into three types. I don't think I've done a flip chart page for this, so you'll have to just bear with me. So they're deep faith, lucid faith, and longing faith. Rather beautiful names, I sometimes think. Deep faith is basically seeing that reality, as described by the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, is the truth, if you see what I mean. So, as distinct from hearing a teaching, it's getting some conviction about that from it, if you see what I mean, like doing the metta bhavana and actually getting this sense in the practice that this other person is not not just a bundle of habits who's been put there to kind of be liked by you or annoy you, or you get this deep sense that another human is a mysterious thing, very much like yourself and connected with yourself, and something slightly unknowable that you're deeply curious about, if you see what I mean. You actually experience that. And the fleetingness of their life, say, so the teaching that all conditioned things are impermanent, you know to be true. Okay, so that's deep faith. Lucid faith is more of a kind of feeling thing. It's like a responsiveness that can even be aesthetic. So that's to values. That would be like an example of like seeing a Buddha figure, and just knowing that is communicating a value, or even a kind of a pleasure or a delight in the qualities expressed by the three jewels. So you could say friendship between people who are practicing. If you observe good friendship between other people who are practicing, say, that might touch a bit of lucid faith, because you know that it has value, but it's enjoyable to sort of be in contact with and feels pleasant, but it has a kind of uplift to it, like an aesthetic quality. So that's a kind of clarity that something has value. And then longing faith is yearning to move towards it, if you see what I mean. So, if there's an enlightened figure who you see a symbol of and you have an aesthetic response, you could say that longing faith is where that then deepens into a genuine wish to move towards this ourselves, and it slightly closes the gap. So where you might acknowledge an ideal that still seems a bit lofty, with longing faith you think, I would actually like to take action to move towards that. So there's a kind of nice way of boiling this down. So that deep, lucid and longing faith can be split into conviction of what is real, lucidity as to what has value, and longing for what is possible. So all of those, now that we've given it their sort of full kind of poetic filling out, are faith. So maybe I'm just going to pause there. We haven't got... we've got a bit of time to see if you've got other examples of arisings of this faith. So a response of what's ultimate in us to what's ultimate in the universe. Yes?
It's not an example so much as a question. So if there's no moral distinction between sort of good and bad, is it possible for there to be faith in seemingly or sometimes destructive behaviors? So an addiction, for example, would Buddhism recognize that there's perhaps a small element of faith in an addiction, in that maybe you're seeking, I don't know, seeking something higher, but maybe ultimately it's not good for you.
Okay, yeah. So that's is there faith in something, in an unhelpful habit?
Yeah.
Could there be? Well, I'm actually just going to go back to the sort of terms of your question there, because it's more that Buddhism doesn't use the language of good and bad. Actually, this distinction between skillful and unskillful is very important and absolutely a moral one, if that makes sense. So what I would say about the addiction question is that underneath unhelpful habits, there probably is some buried longing for value, but you could say that it's gone wrong in that the clarity as to what has value isn't right, if you see what I mean, because the wrong thing is being sought after for satisfaction from that. But I suppose that could just be another way of saying nobody's got no latent positivity. Nobody's got no seeds in them that can't be grown and cultivated towards the skillful, if you see what I mean. So it might just be another way of expressing that. I wouldn't say that addiction itself has faith in it. It's more that our longing to grow is getting kind of mistranslated, if you see what I mean. Does that answer it? So, yes, Peter.
An idea of faith around honesty, so an experience of having been dishonest to someone and then telling the truth to them and feeling that sense of relief. Was that lucidity? Or?
Well, in a way, you fast forwarded a tiny bit there, which is good. But say a bit more about the honesty and the faith.
Well, just that by experiencing a kind of a relief, it's almost like you're experiencing firsthand that honesty is skillful, and that would sort of put faith in the precept of honesty.
Yes, yeah, I think that's quite right. So to phrase that positively, I've had the experience sometimes that when it's difficult to be truthful, but I do nonetheless, relief, as you mentioned, is exactly what I feel. If you narrowly avoid being unskillful, if you sort of manage to take the right turning on time, as it were, rather than missing your turning, it's like coolness rather than heat or something. It's like, oh, phew, avoiding complication and error. So absolutely, I think that's a really good example. So you'd be feeling faith where you decide to be honest, or where you observe it in somebody else. The more I think about it, the best meaning of the word admire is actually a response of faith, because honesty could be something you really admire in another person, couldn't it? Speech that's sort of courageous. So yeah, but we'll come back to the second part of your comment as well, because that's good. Yeah. Any other? Let's just see if there's anyone else first, and we can come back. Yeah, Jessica.
Again.
Sorry. Let's just hear from Jessica behind, and then come back to you. Yeah.
This sort of is quite revealing about what I'm doing with my life. But I was in court a couple of weeks ago, and there was an 83-year-old vicar, and someone almost 90, and also a priest who had all stopped an underground train, an overground train actually, as a kind of climate protest. And because they were people of faith in a Christian sense, but I would say that your faith was also present in the court. The prosecution, the defence, and the judge just didn't even argue about their integrity. It was just completely taken for granted. So what the jury had to do was decide on the merits of how much they disrupted London that day. And it was kind of beautiful because, all the Insulate Britain stuff, people were like, those people are very annoying. But when you saw this grandmother and these people, you couldn't help but know that they were acting with a simpleness with what they were doing that was just very moving to be present, to be in the room with.
Okay, so, well, I like what you said about integrity there in that story, and recognising integrity and not questioning that as well, because I think that, what we're talking about in the Buddhist sense of faith is something that quite often will be intuitive, if you see what I mean, that we recognise straightforwardly, like you described. So yeah.
And so yes, but that's what it sort of did to me.
Right.
It was just like something in me had to honour what was going on.
Yeah.
And I saw that happen to the other people in the room as well.
Yeah. So encourage, presumably, partly. Yeah. Okay, Brian. Yeah.
Yes, just a quick thing. I don't really have. I need to be more truthful. I'm working on that. But actually, faith has given me truthfulness, in that I know whatever happens, karma is on my side. So the consequences of what I do may or may not be seemingly good or bad. May be bad when I do it. I might have the threat of losing out. But I have faith increasingly that if I do the right thing, then I can let karma deal with it. Or I think of some other power dealing with it. And I'm happy to just let go wherever I land up, because I don't know what's going to go on. But the other side of faith for me is that I've never had to try to meditate. I've been coming 23 years and I just sit down and do it. It doesn't even occur to me that I can do it or I can't do it, or that I need to kind of develop this part of that. For me, that's stressful because it just gets in the way. It creates thoughts of strain where there's no strain to start off with. I just know that this works, and I don't even know it works. I just do it, and it just gets stronger. And it's just like I'm somebody who's quite anxious sometimes in some things, but with this I have there's no need for faith or doubt. It's just right, and I just know that without thinking.
Good. Okay. So I think meditation's a good example of something which I think you're saying there. You know to have value.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Prajnamanas, sorry, is it okay if you repeat the questions for people online? Just getting a few comments.
Okay. What I'm trying to do is sort of sum them up back to the question by way of repeating it, but perhaps, and sometimes it's hard to repeat the whole thing, so I'm doing what I can. Sorry if it's not quite enough. So Brian is saying there that when he sits to meditate, he just knows that that's a value and doesn't question it, and that it also delivers you from anxiety that you might have about other matters. Well, you mentioned anxiety at least. Is that fair? Summary?
Yeah. Well, I don't really have to try. There's no effort in trying to evolve my sense of belief that this is the right thing to do. Even the thought of those trying to evolve it is a label which gets in the way. Because I know that it's the right thing to do without even thinking. I don't have to think, is it the right thing to do? How do I develop?
Okay.
It's just already, thankfully, there.
Okay, yeah.
I wish it was there in the rest of my life for everything else.
Sure, yeah. So I think what you're talking about there is trust. You're trusting a practice, which is also an aspect of faith. So I think that is a good example. And I like what you're reflecting about the simplicity of the mental experience as compared with some others when that mental state is present, which is part of what shows you that it's a positive mental event. Yeah. Good. So we need to crack on now because I want to talk about shame, which Peter's already given us a really good example of, because you were talking about, I think if I'm right in remembering, but you mentioned being dishonest and then recognising that was not of value and repairing that in some way. Have I remembered right?
Yeah.
More or less, yeah, good. So yeah, what happens, one of the reasons faith is so important is that it protects us. Okay, so the idea is the more that we draw up and out and sort of enhance and clarify our sense of faith, the more, when we do something that clashes with our values, we'll know it. Okay, and that's where shame comes in. And just to do a quick rectification of terms on this, this term in Buddhism is a positive mental event. It's quite separate from guilt, which is a kind of, I don't know, just a kind of generally self-abnegating blockage and fear of punishment and disapproval and so on. Shame is a positive mental arising in Buddhism, and it's a really, really important one as well, because wherever what we do clashes with what we know to have value, that's what we'll feel. And it's quite often a bodily experience. I mean, I know that in my life, when I've told a lie, it's usually associated with, some kind of blocked or tense sense in the body, if you see what I mean. So I like that you mentioned relief when you deliver yourself from that, or make amends, or apologise, or whatever it was you said. You can actually, and this is part of why we meditate, get a whole psychophysical set of signals about what we're doing and connect that with our sense of faith and use cues, not just from the mind, but from the emotions in the body as well, all of which sort of changes and moves together, like when we're dishonest and then rectify it and are honest again. The reason that, here's another word that's got crossovers with other traditions, but we'll just go past it quickly. Another reason that confession is also important in Buddhist practice at more kind of committed stages. So order members especially usually have a regular confession practice, which is simply where you admit to friends who are also practicing that on the basis of this, you've done something that clashed with it, if you see what I mean, and you've felt shame, in order to sort of disburden yourself of that tension and blockage, move on from it, and of course make amends where necessary. So that's the reason these are paired together in Subhuti's scheme, is that the more your faith grows, actually, the more demanding you get for yourself in a really positive way with shame, if you see what I mean. You might kind of, fail to thank somebody for something, or, even forget the birthday of a friend or something where you know you've got connection to something and you would like to act generously. You don't quite manage to do it. And, well, I don't know, maybe shame's a bit far to go in forgetting a birthday present, but I'm just trying to give an example of something that seems like might be fairly innocuous in the scheme of the world, in the scheme of things generally and in the world, but you might actually regret, if you see what I mean, and that might help, that might actually reconnect you with value and your wish to be generous. Okay, so that's something about the importance of faith and shame. Okay. I think I'm going to move on to clarity and ignorance now. So, got another drawing coming up. I said that clarity is, in its highest expression, the goal. But of course, you can just cultivate clarity all the time at the day-to-day level. So, when we meditate and notice a kind of fogginess in the mind, especially where we can relate that up to this level, and recognise that the qualities and atmosphere of the mind right now are actually a product of our own actions, and take responsibility for them. Clarity is redoubled and kind of emotionally and ethically reinforced, if you see what I mean. So to give a kind of a mundane recent example, when we were meditating the first half of the class, I was having some trouble concentrating personally, and I know that I had quite a full day, and I didn't really manage to stop during the day. So one of my reflections is that something I recognise has value, which would have been keeping some space in the day in order to sort of protect the clarity of my mind, I slightly reneged on. I didn't quite manage. And so that gives me more than just I'm a bit distracted or a bit tense. Do you see what I mean? It relates it back to a kind of cycle of my own, karma, actually, to use the traditional term, is I've produced my own mental states now. So in those day-to-day ways, we can cultivate clarity all the time. But let's just look at something about what we're trying to get away from, which is ignorance. This is really, really important in Buddhism as well. It's sometimes called the root delusion, or the kind of, it's the ultimate issue that from which all of our other difficulties spring. And so it's not ignorance of a particular fact, or, I don't know, being uneducated or something. It's to do with our kind of divorce from reality, if you see what I mean, from how things really are, our failure to see how things really are. Divorce isn't quite the right metaphor, because actually we can move away from this and undo that separation, but it's to do with not being in tune with how things are. And ultimately what that will mean in Buddhism is remaining in the delusion that we are a kind of fixed separate entity that's able to kind of interact with other fixed separate entities, but ultimately a sort of thing. If you know, no, a person isn't a thing, a person is a person, but I feel that I kind of that there's this boundary around me, and inside it is me, if you see what I mean. If I think of me as my body, or me as just exactly my life, if you see what I mean. But it's a definite kind of graspable thing, according to this delusion, that's in here and somehow belongs to me, if you see what I mean. And we either have beliefs that is obliterated at death and simply goes from existing to not existing, which is quite hard to really believe when you look at it, or that even if its expression, i.e. my body, changes or dies, that something ultimate about it will persist. And in Buddhism, those extreme views are called nihilism and eternalism. And you basically find them sort of out there in other discourse in hedonism or materialism, and religions that believe in a soul, if you see what I mean, that perdures through different bodies, or once the body is gone in heaven or hell or whatever it is. So in Buddhism, that's the root delusion. So those beliefs ultimately underlie all of the rest of our suffering, because on that basis we get into other items on this list and these other afflictions like craving and hatred. We want to appropriate things into our life, don't want certain other things. I've had this injury in my knee, and I had an operation recently. I was going to see the surgeon today, and I was thinking about what a kind of drama it's been, going into the hospital, all these appointments. I think a certain amount of fear about, this joint and whether or not it's going to work properly again, and all this stuff. And today I was trying to see it from the surgeon's point of view, at least, and being one in dozens and dozens on his list, just in this week's clinics, if you see what I mean. But also I was trying to see that I'm carrying around this sort of quite substantial feeling narrative about my knee and how it's going to go, what effect that will have, and this kind of huge importance of that in my life, if you see what I mean. And obviously it's true that it's my knee, and it's reasonable not to want to be in more pain than I can avoid. But a lot of the suffering comes from the delusion that there's something ultimate about my existence, and therefore the existence of that part of my body. Do you see what I mean? That on some level I'm clinging. I really, really want a good outcome. I really don't want a bad outcome. Do you see what I mean? Of course we don't want to suffer, so of course that's understandable, but it also touches on what in Buddhism is a delusion. So, forgetting my knee for a minute, I'll just show you something else that the tradition is saying about this. Okay, so here's a drawing of, in case you can't guess, a tree. Okay, here's what happens with ignorance. Subhuti says it so well. I'm gonna read to you. Okay. So he's talking about ignorance being like the root of a poisonous plant. Maybe it's a plant rather than a tree. So he says, okay, the root of ignorance grows in 4 successive stages. Firstly, a shoot pushes up from the root below the surface of the soil. This is self-view. From that shoot, the stem, branches and leaves of craving, hatred and conceit uncurl as the second stage. At the third, the sickly and ill-favoured flowers of views begin to blow. And fourthly, the poisonous stench of vagueness, put forth by these ugly blossoms, drugs the mind and deadens the soul, so one cannot choose but wander, lost and suffering through the terrifying dangers of existence. So it's quite strong stuff, with a bit of poetic flair and a bad smell. And there's quite a lot in this scheme. So I've said that ignorance is the root delusion, and that self-view is the basic expression of that, and that that's the root of other forms of suffering. But you can see that further up the tree, can't you? That you've got branches of hatred. And hatred is basically a shorthand for any type of aversion. It doesn't literally mean where you're so worked up about somebody else that you hate them, although of course it includes that. It's any kind of aversion, like a wish not to be around a certain person, or let's say aversion at an even milder level, like being grumpy about the weather. You see what I mean? You go outside and you're sort of annoyed that it's cold. I say you, it might be me as well, but it simply is cold, but we get into a bit of a mood about the fact that it's cold, if you see what I mean. I mean, that's got various of these involved in it probably, but hatred could be anything from that to, well, complete hatred of another person, I suppose, wanting to destroy someone else. Conceit is basically like comparison, like I'm better than or worse than or equal to another person. Hence those are the leaves. And then you've got this stench coming off the blossoms of vagueness. And that's basically confusion about the whole picture. So that it drugs the mind, vagueness. And that's basically unclarity as to what our task is, even if we're practicing, but certainly what the purpose of life is generally. So it might be that we rationalise our world according to a hatred or a conceit, if you see what I mean. We blame some whole other group of people for our troubles, or want to sort of puff ourselves up so much and succeed so much that we'll finally be happy, if you see what I mean. Vagueness is where, and I think this is quite, must be as widespread now as it's ever been, is basically being blown around by any philosophy we come across and feel like getting into that week, if you see what I mean. Now that, it used to be that you'd basically grow up in the culture and mores of, well, if not even only your country, maybe just the village you were in, if you didn't have communication with outside that. I know probably some people in the world who still live like that, but mainly now you can buy any book, listen to any speaker, get into any idea you want if you're materially equipped for that. And it leads to a kind of confusion, doesn't it? There's so many ideas out there, so many compelling kind of stories about what to sort of do with our energy and with our time. And of course the messages of in an affluent West, well, and actually a less affluent other parts of the world, messages of advertising are trying to very strongly get us to believe in something that is our purpose and something for us to move towards. But yeah, in here could be any way we're deciding to interpret the world in order to try and get away from our own suffering. So we need to cultivate clarity, because this is, to put it really, really strongly, this is our predicament. Obviously, these are unskillful states. But the really kind of good piece of news is, well, two. One is that ignorance, in its ultimate expression, we're not actually to be blamed for, because the belief in a fixed and separate self comes wrapped up with this birth, if you see what I mean. We can't really be blamed for developing that, if you see what I mean. If a small child has it, so of course it's in our patterning and somewhere in our history, which doesn't mean that it can't be uprooted. So it's not in itself unskillful. And that's the other piece of good news, is that it can be uprooted, because ignorance is secondary to the clarity that is actually the ultimate nature of the mind. So Buddhism's saying, and personally, in my better moments, I can actually resonate with this as true, i.e. respond with faith to this idea, is saying that the mind ultimately is clear and luminous. It just gets covered over with all these other things. Sometimes it's said it gets covered over with adventitious defilements, which means murky things that have been put on top, if you see what I mean, that have arrived later, and that the mind ultimately is clear and bright. So clarity needs cultivating, and the reason I like the tree image is that you do this backwards or upside down. So you start by clearing up vagueness, if you see what I mean. You think, okay, well, in my case, say, I'm going to practice the Dharma. I'm going to try and do that. It's going to be hard. I'm going to get it wrong loads of times. I'm very unwise, but I'm going to go for that. It's like a commitment. It really helps with vagueness, at least. It doesn't completely get rid of it, but you weed out all the other options and say, I'm going to go for something that I resonate with as having value. Conceit's probably where you get more into confession and think, okay, while I was doing that, I thought I was better than someone else, or I've had this kind of convenient, slightly self-pitying thing where I can't really do it, and that's kept me stuck, because in some ways being stuck is more comfortable than admitting I can grow. Examine all our aversions, however deep they are, and they can be deeper than we know, and there are aversions that are difficult to acknowledge that we need to uncover, and then we can get at self-view and ultimately uproot ignorance. Sounds good, but just one more thing on how we do it. Just the green list, first of all, listening, reflecting and cultivating. Those are three ways towards wisdom in Buddhism. So we are practicing them all. Before we go into them, we are kind of practicing, or doing our best to practice them all, by doing something like come along here. Listening is where we come across a teaching. Reflecting, we mull it over for ourselves and think, do I actually believe that all conditioned things are impermanent? Or that metta is the right thing to cultivate towards other people? You sort of ask yourself honestly. And cultivating is where you try and get it into your bones. You don't just believe, even strongly, that metta is the best response to another person. You try and get into metta and dwell in it, as in the meditation practice, and just sort of be and exist as much as you can from that place, for however much time you can manage. And you can express these, if you like, as knowledge, understanding and wisdom, just to give them really everyday terms. Okay, so these are the sort of three levels of wisdom, and although we're doing them all the time, they are in something of a hierarchy, because this is where you make contact with a teaching, which for most of us is not enough, because our faith is not strong enough. If our faith was really strong, like some people in the stories in the old Buddhist stories, they simply hear the teaching and bang, they're kind of enlightened. Well, they are enlightened. We probably need to reflect quite a lot more and meditate quite a lot more. So that's how we, in our day-to-day way, kind of, well, uproot the tree from the top down. Using our faith, cultivating the sense of shame so that you steer yourself more and more sensitively and wisely to sort of get at the ignorance and work more and more towards the clarity that, as I say, ultimately culminates in Buddhahood or complete enlightenment. Okay, I'll leave it there. So that's transforming the mind. Next week, if you like, we'll pick up from where I've just finished there. So next week we're doing the enlightened mind. So looking at, or maybe just gazing in a bit of wonder at, the goal, what that's like. And again, as always, what it might mean for us, but the ideal itself, rather than this work towards it, the ideal, some symbols and images for that, and how to kind of dwell on it a bit more.